afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sia, an Equal Opportunity Student Ambassador. Thank you for coming for the public lecture on Building Leadership in STEM Disciplines in Higher Education, the Myth of the Pipeline. Organized by the Equal Opportunity Unit in collaboration with the Australian Consulate General of Hong Kong to mark International Women's Day as part of HKU's HeForShe initiative. I would like to invite our President and Vice Chancellor, Peter Matheson, to give an introductory remark. Professor Matheson, please.
Thank you very much, Sia. Yes, so it is indeed the week of International Women's Day. It's not exactly International Women's Day, but our speaker has been busily travelling around what sounds like about 3/4 of Asia to speak on this and related topics, including International Women's Day. So it's a great pleasure for us to have Professor Caroline McMillen here with us today. Professor McMillen is Vice Chancellor of the University of Newcastle. Her lecture, as you've heard, is entitled Building Female Leadership in STEM Disciplines in Higher Education, the Myth of the Pipeline. We hear a lot about the pipeline, and I've talked about the pipeline. I'm interested to hear why it's a myth and how we can do something about the myth. So that'll be a challenging topic. Professor McMillen has been in academic leadership positions for many years now. Before she joined the University of Newcastle as Vice Chancellor and President in October 2011, she served as Deputy Vice Chancellor and Vice President of Research and Innovation at the University of South Australia. She was appointed Professor, Chair and Head of the Department of Physiology at the University of Adelaide in 1992. As a biomedical researcher, Professor McMillen is internationally recognised for her work on the impact of the nutritional environment before birth on the risk of developing cardiovascular and metabolic disease and obesity in adult life. A really interesting and important topic which has been very prominent internationally, and Professor McMillen has played a very significant role in that development of that field. Her research group has been funded continuously for 2 decades by both the Australian Research Council and the National Health and Medical Research Council. She's published more than 200 publications and been invited to present at more than 70 international and national meetings. She's also currently the chair of the Endocrinology, Reproduction and Development Commission of the International Union of Physiological Societies, the only Australian chair on this international body. She served on state government groups focused on building innovation, climate change, manufacturing and the resources industry. Professor McMillen was a member of the Prime Minister's Science, Engineering and Innovation Council Working Group on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, focusing on maternal, fetal and infant health. She's an inaugural fellow of the can't be right, my notes are wrong, the Australian something of Health and Medical Sciences College? Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, and a Bragg member of the Royal Institution Australia. She's a very distinguished speaker in a number of fields, but particularly well known for her own research and for her leadership in issues around gender equality. So it's a great pleasure for us to have her here. The event, as you heard, is partly badged under the university's efforts under the United Nations HeForShe initiative. We're doing our best to challenge some of the issues around gender equity in this university and in the university sector in Hong Kong and more widely, and it's great to find another ally in that work, and I hope that this will be the beginning of a conversation that Caroline and I can continue about how to learn from best practice in other parts of the world. So with no further ado, Caroline, please deliver your talk to us on building female leadership in STEM disciplines in higher education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Matheson. Would Professor Matheson please remain on stage to present a souvenir to Professor McMillen? Thank you, Professor Matheson. May I invite Professor McMillen to, Professor Matheson and Professor McMillen, may we invite Professor McMillen to the stage to present the lecture on building leadership in STEM disciplines in higher education, the myth of the pipeline. Professor McMillen.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And it's wonderful on a Friday afternoon to see so many faces of both students and staff today. And it's wonderful to meet our new Colombo Plan Scholar from Macquarie University in the audience. Look, what I thought I might do is in this presentation speak a little about my own journey and reflect on some of the issues in moving through those rungs of leadership. And then to reflect more broadly on issues of leadership in higher education, and in particular how we can address some of the data, some of the statistics behind which lie people's careers in more broad terms as we move forward to address the issues of gender parity in science-based careers. I'd just like to say I've had the most remarkable time in 11 days. I think I know where I am, and I think I know it's Friday. Over 11 days, I visited 7 cities and had an opportunity to learn from leaders in industry, business, government, and academia about issues relating to progress of women through not only science-based careers, but innovation and entrepreneurship careers. This has been because the Australian government, through the good auspices of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, every year takes 2 weeks to host a female speaker on issues of direct relevance to female careers. And I thank our consulate today in Hong Kong and our embassies and consuls across the 7 cities I've visited. Okay, now I just thought I'd start with a bit of the journey, because I do think our careers often have within them the imprint of where we started, where we came from, our family, where our cultural basis. And there are many voices in our heads as we're moving through our careers, which are often the voices from our backgrounds. I was born in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and it's a harbour city, you can see here. Northern Ireland at the time I was growing up was in quite some trouble. There was a lot of violence, it was a split community, and my father decided he would take us from Northern Ireland, and we moved to this town in Northern England. Now, it may not look an auspicious town. If we look here, we can see the steelworks that really drove the pattern of life in that town. But for me, in that move from Belfast through here to Northern England, it was actually an extremely important move. I'd been at an all-girls school in Belfast, and education was not necessarily seen to be something, and particularly in science, that we were going to focus on. I moved to a very large state school, comprehensive school here, but suddenly there was an attention being paid to my education and an attention being paid to an education in science. One day a teacher said to me, and I think great teachers are remarkable and change lives, and a teacher said to me, "Caroline, why don't you think of applying to Oxford University?" I had no idea what that meant. I had never seen what you do to apply to Oxford. It seemed to me, while it may have been a 3-hour train journey, for me it might as well have been in Hong Kong. Well, I thought, well, I'll give it a go, and we ordered in some of the papers to read the exams, and I sat the entrance exam, and I had an interview, and my introduction to the interview was I arrived off the train on a cold night in Oxford, and I went in through the doors to a sherry party. I don't know if any of you have ever tasted sherry. It's pretty awful. So there I was, trying to sip my sherry, swallow it at the same time, and engage in what I hoped was conversation with some pretty scary people. And they were just the applicants. The interviewers were even more scary. Well, as these things worked through, I was accepted. My mother came up to my school with a telegram. That's how long ago it was, a telegram. And it said, you know, you've been accepted into Oxford. And it was for me a sliding doors moment. Life is full of sliding doors moment when suddenly, because you said yes to a suggestion, you were prepared to take a risk, something has happened to your surprise, and as you move through the sliding doors, your life changes. For me, it was an opportunity to enjoy science. I was passionate about this. I moved through, I wanted to do my PhD, and it was in the area of why, as small as an embryo is, that everything that happens to that embryo, that small collection of cells, from the time it's conceived, about its environment, how it adapts, has everything to do with our health in later life. And I was just starting out on that journey with my PhD. My supervisor was Australian, and I got on very well with him because he was very relaxed, and also he offered me, actually pulled the fridge out, it was a cold beer, not a sherry. So it was a good start. However, our origins are often about our destination. My family in Northern Ireland had very fierce aunts. I don't know if many of you have fierce aunts or parents who thought I wasn't a proper doctor. I was a PhD, but that's not a proper doctor. That's a Northern Irish accent. And so I did medicine in Cambridge, partly because I thought that will be a great education, partly because I thought I might want to be a proper doctor, in my Northern Irish aunt's terms, and partly because my family would no longer keep on at me to do it. So I completed that, and one night I was working in a sick children's hospital in Edinburgh, in Scotland, when my Australian supervisor called and said, "Caroline, come out to Monash University, Australia, just for a year." And the wind was howling outside, it was cold, and I thought, science, research, beaches, sun, warm. And I said, yes on the spot, another moment, we're just taking that chance, that risk, that I knew what I wanted to do. I wasn't sure quite what that was, but that move to me made sense. And at that time, when going through that remarkable opportunity of education, at no time did I have any concern that gender was going to be part of my future. Because I know, and I knew at that time, and this is a quote from a famous biology professor at MIT around the 1990s, that each generation of young women begin by believing that gender discrimination was solved in the previous generation and would not touch them. Now, I think that's a really important part of moving forwards at the beginning of your career with real optimism, unimpeded by any doubt. And I think now for young women in particular, that that's a critical piece of getting the forward momentum. Now, as I went through my career, going to a lectureship, a new lecturer, I found that medical research and medical education was my passion, rather than medical practice. We've got a very distinguished medical practitioner in your president. I was not going to move into that career. My husband is a doctor. He believed I made the right decision for human health. Trust me. So as I moved into that career, really there were lots of things I'm glad I didn't know, because they would have given me pause, and I don't think pause is a good thing. I didn't know at the time, as I moved through up the academic ladder, that there had been work done in Sweden showing that in a peer review scoring system for postdoctoral fellowships, the system actually was found to rate women with the same achievements at a lower level than men with the same achievements. And that this caused quite a stir in peer review circles where we hold to the principle of merit. It challenged the possibility that merit was not something objective, but it could be something subjective, where values-based or values-based belief system could play a role, and not necessarily one that supported women. I also thought there's a literature, which I only came to know later when people asked me to speak, and I thought I had better, like a good researcher, go to the literature, that men and women both rate resumes. When they rate resumes, they give lower marks or lower assessments to resumes when they are told it is a woman's. That's slightly worrying. Student ratings are tougher on women, and the MIT resources study about allocation of resources to women professors in science found that as women progressed in seniority, they gradually accumulated more and more small decrements in pay, in facilities allocation, in intramural funds, that couldn't be explained by differences in levels of ability. And in particular, problems flourished when departments had non-democratic, non-transparent processes, and somehow the status quo was simply iterated on. And I think this is a starting point that gives pause. I do recall once that there was, and I've seen the study, a paper published by Joan Smith, J. Smith, or John Smith, is rated by both men and women. The ratings go higher for John Smith than J. Smith, and higher for J. Smith than Joan Smith. That also gives you pause for peer review. I was very grateful, an American journal had done an editorial on a piece of work we'd done. I was at the meeting in the States. I went up to the editor to say thank you for the op-ed, the nice editorial. It was endocrinology as a journal, and I thought I should acknowledge it. The editor said to me, I said, thank you very much for your editorial. He said, I'm terribly sorry, but who are you? As only Americans can do sometimes. So I said, well, look, I'm Caroline McMillen. He said, Caroline McMillen, what do we do, prolactin receptor? He said, oh, you're I.C. McMillen, because I published with my initials. I thought you were a man. I think as soon as he said it, there was a moment of sheer horror. But it meant to me, actually, I would keep on publishing with my initials, because somehow that gendered nature to peer review, I could never quite be sure about, wouldn't actually apply. And I think as I went through my career, I moved from Monash in Melbourne across to Adelaide in South Australia, the University of Adelaide. I was a very young appointee to a chair, and our family moved together, and I began to exercise early leadership, which is quite difficult when you're, in a sense, beginning to understand the dimensions of what leadership of a small department means. And then I went on to be a Dean of Science at the University of Adelaide. At this point in career structure and career progression, you move from a protege, where people are championing your career as a young woman, and now you are a challenger. You are a competitor for resources. And this is when it begins to get suddenly a little tough. And it's captured very well in this article by Eagly and Carley in the Harvard Business Review, who capture the sense that for women, career progression may not be linear. It does not have an order to it. Rather, it is as if one is navigating a labyrinth. And the passage through that labyrinth is not simple or direct, but requires a persistence and awareness of one's progress and a very careful analysis of the puzzles that lie ahead. Because all labyrinths do have a viable route to the centre, it's understood that you can attain your goals. But for women aspiring to top leadership, routes exist, but are full of twists and turns, both unexpected and expected. When I read this article, as I've been progressing through managing larger areas, leading areas of science, and doing my own research, as I continue to do, because of that wonderful passion for the way in which how we develop has that impact on our health, this made sense to me. Because for women aspiring to senior leadership roles, the signals are often contradictory, and it can become disheartening. It can be an internal sense that you are not actually made for leadership, but rather, in fact, you are in a labyrinth, and a rather more labyrinthine structure than your colleagues. And part of that navigation is some simple and straightforward pieces, because in the main, men through in universities and in many leadership roles mostly have been held by men. It is not unreasonable that both men and women relate or connect leadership traits with men, and that fewer will connect women with the capacity to have those leadership traits. So that long history, in a sense, of men being in leadership roles defines what we innately think leadership looks like. And we can understand that. And it can explain why, for instance, Oxford University, after some 800 or 900 years, has just appointed its first female vice-chancellor. Took some time, and we don't know yet whether 1 in 900 years is a pattern. Okay. The other piece I found in this article, where there'd been a great deal of work and studies on behaviours in meetings. Now, how many meetings we all meted? We meet in a lot in universities. But this is what is quite interesting. Non-verbal dominance, if you stare at others or you point at people while you're speaking, if you are assertive as a woman, it can reduce your chances of success and advancing in your career. And just disagreeing with people around a table can get women into more trouble than their male colleagues who disagree. Now, this was captured through this article, and I recommend you read it, and it gave me pause, because the art of science is debate and argument, working out what you consider is a way in which a system might work, and then having the debate with your scientific colleagues. And as a Northern Irish person, the whole art form in Ireland is to argue like mad. The way you decide you're going to make a cup of tea is to argue with everyone in your family. Arguing in Ireland is a complete art form. So here was I in science, which required me professionally to debate, and from a family who thought, having a relaxing day was to find a topic that we all disagreed on and then fiercely fight it out to the last one standing. And this gave me a sense that my background and my career choice, in a sense, collided with these leadership cues around table, and why some of the signals can be contradictory. As I went further along that career path, I began to feel that there were not quite so many women around the table that I'd started with, all for good reasons. But now, not only must you not argue, but there are fewer of you to argue with. There are fewer women around that table. And I wondered, because life is busy, I'd had 3 children in very quick succession, and to be honest, there were about 5 or 10 years in my life which I don't think I can remember anything of. I had no sleep perpetually, and as all parents and all scientists do, juggling the laboratory, sciences at 9 to 5, doing experiments that required me to be there night and day, writing those grants, those publications, doing the long haul flights. If you work in Australia, everywhere is more than 12 hours away. And so reasonably, it was a pretty intense phase of family life. But as I came through that time and looked around, I wondered where my colleagues were, who'd done their PhDs with me, who were in great labs. And in science, as you aspire to leadership, and I think it's fair to say in any discipline that we are practice, if you're going to take a leadership role, you do need to have the credentials of a leading academic, because your colleagues will understand what it has taken to arrive at that position, and they will pay you the respect for the work that you have done and its quality. So it is absolutely clear that being a leading academic in your field is necessary to have the credibility to exercise good leadership beyond your own discipline, even beyond a group or a faculty. People want to know you have achieved. If you are going to run a very large medical enterprise, they want to know that you know how and in what way, what good practice, best practice looks like. So it was necessary and very clear that for me in acquiring and working hard to be good in my discipline was important. But what I became aware of is that that in and of itself is not sufficient. Just being a leading academic, becoming a professor, is not sufficient to be an excellent academic leader. It's necessary but not sufficient. There are other qualities and capabilities that need to be exercised. But where were my female cohort, who we were all going through together? These are data in Australia, and they show what pretty much data across most of the countries I've visited show. We are very similar in that regard. This is the proportion of the commencing enrolments in science-related fields. The pink here are women, and the black are men, and this is basically over close to a decade, from 2002. And what you can see is, for most of that period, we're either close to or actually more than the proportion of men coming through those fields. So in undergraduate education, there is a healthy parity between men and women going through science-based careers. There's a great pipeline being primed. But this is what happens. And this happens whether I look at this in the 1990s, the early 2000s, or 2012. It hasn't changed. So this is now the proportion of men and women who are in Australian universities, below starting lectureship level, going up to the more senior positions, and here are the professorial positions. And when I found that my colleagues weren't there, I was right. They had left the system. Here you see we start pretty well. There is more of us around the early pre-lectureship stage, and at every career stage we see a loss in proportion terms of women in relation to our male colleagues. By the time you get here, it's about somewhere around 15 to 17%, depending on your discipline, and proportionally, of course, the gap made up in the higher proportion by men. This curve I have been watching for presentations given in the 1980s. I didn't see the presentation, but it was written in the University of Adelaide debate on gender equity that we simply have to wait for the pipeline of women to move through. That was fine, 1983. 1990, the same statistics, we have to wait. By this time, we're now talking that at this rate, as it were, of female professors in science, it will take to something like 2057 before there are 50% of professors in science who are women, which was more than 100 years after I was born, and I don't know if I have confidence in the data, having seen such little change in the period of time. What's also interesting, not only do women leave science-based academic careers, they also quit from the science, engineering and technology professions. So these are the women who quit, and as a proportion of these professional careers, and you're looking at between 4 and 5 women in every 10 leave the career for which they were trained, for which they've had sometimes 8 years of education, and for which they have had an interest and an early passion. Now, we are not alone, and this is 2006, and this was combined data in the OECD, and this is now taking levels of seniority now in research agency terms, and it applies to professional careers, The two lines simply show marginal growth across that period. Here are the women, here are the men, and here you are. Strikingly similar. So, we have the scissors diagram, and if I would love my career to be at its endpoint, never to see another scissor diagram again. Because as we look at scissor diagrams, we look and hope, and we say, look, I think it's nudging up. I think it might be 18%. Wow, great, 2057. So, here we have the outcome in Australia is that women comprise more than 50% of our science PhDs and early career researchers, but only 17% of our senior professors in Australian universities and research institutes are women. Less than 1 in 5 professorial positions are occupied by women, and the loss of female science is clearly a waste of training, talent, and the concern that's being raised by the Australian Academy of Science, it impacts on our productivity and our performance as a nation that will be dependent on science for its productivity and performance. And I'll talk about that shortly. This you may not be able to see, and I've just managed to highlight one with my PowerPoint skills. If you look at Hong Kong, that the journey of women to those senior roles is not simply a science story. It is a gendered story of leadership. It is an interesting one. It is perhaps sharper in science, but it is not solely in science. So when we look here, and this is in countries across Asia, and this is now looking at the career pipeline through management, not necessarily in science, in any industry sector, to the CEO, and then to membership of boards. What you see here, and I'll read the data for Hong Kong, so we have 54% of graduates are female. We move to entry-level positions, again about 52. Mid to senior management, now 23%. Then we come to executive committee, 11%. CEOs, 2%. And then we go up a bit for 9% for boards. That's a leaky pipeline of leadership. So we're not saying, I think here, that STEM is any more protected or enabled than other careers. And reasonably, if you do look, and I've been visiting, we've had mainland China figures, we've had Japan. If we look in Japan, for instance, what you see is that it drops more quickly. Executive committee 1% versus Hong Kong's 11%, less than 1% CEOs and 2% on the board. So countries show the same pattern. It's just a difference of degree of steepness of the fall, and reasonably, though absence of people around leadership tables that I have experienced in my career as I moved through was actually real. I remember once I was asked to do a debate on gender equity because you are the senior woman. And I went and read up and did some work. And I started the debate by saying, look, I was going to discuss this topic with the other female professors in my faculty, but she wasn't in her room. So that was an actual true instance. So I'm perfectly prepared to have a good discussion on the pipeline myth. This was a paper published about 2 weeks ago, actually, in which it looks at is there a pipeline for senior women coming through? And Heather Johnson says, look, this myth is a persistent idea that there are too few women qualified for leadership positions, and that all we've got to do is to prime the pipeline further. So more women in on those undergraduate and doctoral positions will drive that pipeline through. But the data indicate there are more than enough qualified women available to fill leadership positions currently. And in fact, it argues that the pipeline is preparing women at a greater rate than it is preparing men. And if you look at female students who've earned more than half in the US their baccalaureate degrees for the past 3 decades, and all doctoral degrees for almost a decade. So what they're saying is, maybe we should think about the pipeline in a different way. Maybe we should try and intervene not at the beginning and just hope that the flow through comes out with the right result, but maybe we should intervene on that leakiness of the pipeline and determine what are the structural elements or cultural elements that cause women to leave. Now, not only as a leader in higher education are you navigating the elements of being a leading academic, understanding your science, learning skills as you go, having the questions you ask in the labyrinth of leadership. You also have in higher education a wonderful, complex, exciting, and sometimes puzzling challenge. And I just thought I'd place some of the leadership pieces of senior leadership in universities in a little bit in perspective, because I personally believe in that transformative power of education that I benefited from. I see in my role in the University of Newcastle every day an Indigenous young woman who came to us without a school leaving certificate, who is now at Harvard doing her PhD. You know, when lives change as teachers, as leaders, we absolutely understand that what we do every day is important, but it's difficult. Now, here we had a nice article written that's oft quoted about what makes a great university. And essentially nobody in this room would argue about the need for strong leadership with a great vision, good assessment of your strengths, your weaknesses, setting goals a little bit in the more uncomfortable zone, get a plan that's going to work and that people engage with, and really make sure you're renewing staff, structures, infrastructure. A great sort of nice capture of what it needs in very large organisations such as Hong Kong University, such as our own, to really ensure that you're keeping on your toes in leadership. And I like this statement, which is if you become complacent, if you lack that ambitious vision for a better future, then really, and you just keep going as you have, then really what we see in the global world of higher education is a growing performance gap between those who think it's okay and those who know it's not, and we've got to keep moving. The other piece for staff here, and I'm sure you recognise this, that sometimes when you're exercising leadership, you've got in academic fields that culture of the individual where sometimes a collective effort is required. And bringing people's passions together to make something greater than the sum of the disciplinary parts is not as easy as saying we will have an interdisciplinary research centre. Yes, and then you've 3 different languages between your engineers, your medical folk, and maybe your IT folk coming together in a great development of a medical device for human health. They all speak different languages, they're not sure why they're working together, and you have to build up the environment that supports that. Academics are used to failure because we fail a lot. Our papers don't get published, our grants don't get funded. We have to learn early that failure is endemic, and it's people are never going to stand up and introduce you as a speaker and read out the list of grants you didn't get. So you really do have to ensure that when you're working in a global academy, you know that success should be savoured, but learning to handle failure is much more important. I call this asking in academic life, asking thoroughbred horses, you know, that are really talented to carry the workload of, we call them Clydesdales, you know, they draw the big barrels behind them. And that can cause people to really feel they're carrying a very heavy workload. And finally, when you aspire to leadership, you do have to know that your colleagues now think you're no longer the creative person you were yesterday when you're doing that fabulous science. Now you're part of management, and management can be a culture which is seen to be antithetical to the academic culture. These are all good challenges, and they set the backdrop. So coming through that leadership leadership career and coming through into a role as a vice president in research and innovation. I maintain my research, as we do in our academic leadership roles. But what I had was the remarkable experience of going from an institution that is part in Australia, the University of Adelaide, of a group of 8, fabulous institution, and moving to a 20-year-old institution. Now, when I had left England to come to Australia, my medical consultants told me my career was ended. And I knew that had to be. My career had gone. I went to Australia, you know. It's a long way away. I accepted my fate. And when I went across the road from a 180-year-old university to a 20-year-old university, my colleagues told me, your career is over. Well, you know, it's a very interesting world, sometimes listening to what it is that will stretch you, that you know you've explored your leadership role well. But for me, this was an institution where people tended to walk out of the door to connect with industry, business and government leaders, and I knew I would learn enormous amounts about the world through going out the door, rather than perhaps expecting people to come always in the door. So into that domain took me into a world in which we're looking at research and its role in providing solutions to some of the challenges on the planet, some of the challenges within our country, and some of the challenges in our region. And it began to allow me to think much more about the role of research excellence that really drives world-class innovation to support national productivity and drive the development of clever new technologies that have a benefit to health, environmental work and social innovation. So in this journey now that I've described, what I've done and what I think in the last 5 years or so is I have reason for optimism. Whilst the data I've shown you might suggest, well, she's a scientist, why would she have reason for optimism with that data set? I actually do think it's a timing. And it's not just a timing in Australia, there's a timing in the world on this. There is, I think, beginning to be a shared understanding in the developed and developing world, emerging and established economies. And McKinsey, and the reason I think is because this backdrop has come in to the narrative, which has previously been about the difficulty of an individual adapting to a system, and has now moved to the importance of the system adapting to women. McKinsey did a report that said, look, if you actually achieve parity, gender parity in workforce participation, in leadership and in the pay gap, it would add $28 trillion to the global GDP. It's quite a lot. And reasonably, if you just aim a bit lower, you know, just get as good as the country next door to yourself, well, that would be 12 trillion, which is still a reasonable amount of money. And so what we're seeing is a view put that if we have more women participating in the workforce, particularly in those nations with an ageing population like our own, and that face pressure in having a workforce available, then reasonably recruiting the potential on your doorstep will make the outcome much better. I'm not going to show this. This is a graph. All we need to see here are that these two bars are invariably higher across time than the blue bar. The other narrative is that diversity around tables where important decisions are made allows those decisions to be better decisions. This is looking actually in the company corporate sector of 26,000 company directors, and what they're looking at are boards of companies across this period of time, and what was the impact of having one, which is the grey, or at least two, which is the purple bar, women on the board. And the outcome was quite staggering in terms of a return on equity, and these data have been replicated in different ways not to anyone's surprise, just that it had not been done in that way. And the authors would argue, look, it's not a case that women are better than men or there's a better ability for one gender versus the other, but that a more diverse group around a table does make for better decision making, just something as university presidents we have to keep to the fore of our minds. And the speed with which change is embraced to include more women around that table will prove to be the most important and challenging variable. And, this is Credit Suisse, so they are not setting out, I think, to champion gender equity. They're simply saying, reasonably, the data show that if you're not promoting diversity as a CEO, you're not acting in the interests of your company or your shareholders, and you should be held accountable. Now, more of these data are coming in to populate at a time when, certainly in our country, we have some challenges that are now moving well into that post-industrial era. In the global context, as you well know, advanced economies are moving in to be based less on the traditional heavy industries, but more on knowledge, often STEM-based industries that drive the new products, processes, and also support great entrepreneurship. And top-performing global economies can drive 30% of their GDP through knowledge-based economy. In Australia, at the moment, we've had a very historical reliance on mining, resources, traditional manufacturing, and we haven't built a knowledge-based economy. And so what our government is clear about is we have to get started, or else we'll be falling behind the 8 ball, having had a reliance on such great resource-based economy for some time. And that means we need to get universities and governments and communities and academics together. And I think the evidence suggests that this is a completely appropriate analysis. Our chief scientist in the last 2 years in Australia has looked at, for instance, where we've had economic growth, and where we've had economic growth, increases in R&D substantially boost that growth. Publicly funded R&D, the sort of work that universities do, has a high rate of return and demonstrably drives productivity growth in the community. And private R&D delivers high returns to firms, but then they flow on, those returns, to the working people in those firms and their communities. So whichever way you look at it, for a long period of time working in universities, people would assume that your research had little benefit. But indeed, it is R&D that drives the economy. But what we have in Australia is a remarkable record of both contributing more than punching above our weight in terms of publications. Our share of the top 1% of the world's publications is close to 7%, and that's a pretty impressive achievement. We are rated very highly in the sciences, but the difficulty is that our research excellence is not connected through support, through engagement with our industry and business colleagues to drive that engine room of innovation. We actually rank very low on research collaboration for small to medium-sized enterprises, very low for working with large firms. Only 3% of large firms and 2% of our small firms collaborate with any research organisation in Australia. It would be very unusual here. And rather few, therefore, of those firms, of any firm, delivers innovation to the world. And only one in three Australian researchers actually work in industry, which is actually very different to most knowledge-based economies where at least 2 in 3 of our PhDs actually work in the business or industry sector. So we're really good at the research. We are not connected in a supply chain to take that knowledge through to delivery. And reasonably, this report by Committee for Economic Development of Australia told us 5 million of our jobs are going to go in the next 20 years or so. Those jobs are ones which you can all identify, haven't got a lot of social interaction or creativity. They'll be replaced by automation. And we're going to need at least 2 million new jobs, which are going to be requiring more higher credentials and qualifications. And future skills education has to be around, again, innovation and entrepreneurship. So, here we have an Australia that needs well-credentialed participants in its economy to drive a knowledge-based economy. That means if we don't recruit women, we lose that innovation potential and we lose the productivity associated with it. This moves us from an individual question of equity to an economic question of how do we ensure we have broad participation across our community in the new economy. Do we really want a digital literacy or science literacy gaps between rural and urban Australia, between our Indigenous populations possibly and our non-Indigenous, between our women and our men in broad terms? How can we make sure we do not have, in a sense, a knowledge-based economy which is only for one part of our population? Which means if we cannot have confidence that a leaky pipeline will work to deliver the innovation potential of women in STEM, then what will? If we put the pipeline to one side, because if it does, well, we're ahead. But if we try and begin to fix that now, there's a fighting chance we won't be looking back in 10 years saying, somebody standing up saying, oh, the myth of the pipeline. So I see no loss in getting going and seeing what we can do to an intractable problem. You know, the scientist in me says, we've done this experiment, we've done it for 30 years, we're still getting the same results, so maybe we could do another experiment. One of the issues for women is that mentorship plays a role, and mentorship came into many of our careers. I just thought I'd share with you, because it was slightly disconcerting, another Harvard Business Review study, because mentorship is meant to give us resilience through the pipeline. In that study, they looked at men and women from top MBA programs. Women were paid less in their first post-MBA job, they had significantly less career satisfaction, and more of them had mentors. That's interesting. They did a follow-up study some 2 years later. So women had more mentorship, remember, men received more promotions, and mentorship was a significant predictor of promotion for men, but not for women. So, the way this study unfolds, there was a punchline actually, was that they said more women mentors tend to be empathetic, kind, encouraging, but may not be the most influential members of the firm, and actually are not prepared outside of the mentorship relationship to sponsor their mentee, to say, I think this person should be on the stage for the international plenary. I think she would be a great speaker in our local symposium. There seemed to be a hesitancy among female mentors or female mentees to sponsor them in a very direct way, to ensure their name got mentioned, to ensure their case was put at the right time. And reasonably, it's worth reading that story because that study rather, it goes into what makes good sponsorship, which is worth reading. But finally, how and in what way can we understand the leaky pipeline in science? There's been a great deal of work, and it basically all shows the same thing. So this shows in 2006 something that was shown recently in 2014. Women may enter their careers at a later stage and are more likely to be offered then part-time or temporary rotating contracts. They have, in many cultures and many families, the role of childcare and the organisational attitudes to family and work balance can mean that they might be viewed as not necessarily going to stay with the organisation for a long time. The gendered system for the evaluation of scientific excellence we've talked about, which might impact on your advancement, of which there is still evidence to consider. And as you go through, you're expected in the same time to really have that productivity going. And if you want to take a team leadership position, you'll need a higher level of productivity than your peers to do so, and that may be difficult within a period of time. And then there are a lack of role models around the tables you're sitting at for female leadership, so reasonably you think, well, maybe I'm not cut out for it. So just to finish, I think if women don't succeed in this system and we're going to lose that innovation potential, then let's have a think about how we could change the system so that women do succeed in it. Why would your career be defined by 5 years experience early in your career when you've got another 30 years, particularly with an ageing population? All of us will probably be working until we're 70. So reasonably, there are some very key issues here. In Australia, we've been addressing this at the moment, and I'm working with a group called the Science for Australia Gender Equity Initiative. It's out of the Academies of Science and the Academy of Technological Science and Engineering, and the steering group, national steering group on which I sit, is chaired by the Nobel laureate, Brian Schmidt. So this is a group determined to address what the structural issues are. We're considering redefining the ideal scientific researcher, and one of the issues that comes up is, should we be measuring, using a measure of the body of work that characterises an independent investigator, and then understand when a woman or a man has reached that. We don't have that sort of, in a sense, clear milestone in career terms in science, because science is a bit ad hoc as a profession. Rather than define a time period in which you need to achieve it, it's the timing that's the issue, not the capability of producing a body of work with a longer time that is an issue. The SAGE initiative, which is SAGE initiative, is using as one of its instruments across institutions the Athena Swan Charter, Scientific Women Academic Network Charter, which was introduced in the UK. Now the reason we're doing that is it's an intervention which has been shown to have some impact, and we're prepared to modify it as we go for Australia. So what we're trying to do is to improve that gender equity, particularly as you move through the career pipeline. We met with the Equality Challenge Unit in the UK, which runs the Charter programme. The Charter sets a series of serious obligations on institutions to not intend to achieve, but to achieve outcomes. You get a bronze, silver and so forth award, and then you carry that as your badge. In the UK, one of the funding organisations at one time required that institutions have an Athena Swan Charter Award if they were to be eligible for funding, which focuses the mind of university presidents. So the Athena Swan pilot, which presents all the materials to universities, we then go through the next 2 years to bring our institution up to the bar, and then we'll be assessed. If we've hit the bar, we'll get the award. If we don't, we work until we do. And I found it interesting, a recent House of Commons report did find that this charter was the most comprehensive and practical schema to improve academic careers and address gender equity. At this stage, I'm prepared to try the experiment, because in the absence of anything that has been tested, it's worth doing. I won't go through the principles of the Charter. They're available, but they make very good sense when you think about career progression and the relationship of institutions to the women they employ. So we're the first nation to pilot it. 32 institutions are taking part, including our university. This is our Pro Vice Chancellor, Research and Innovation, looking very cheerful because she's our champion, and she's hoping she'll get more time in the lab, but she might not, because she's our champion. And really, we've got to demonstrate a solid foundation for eliminating gender bias and an inclusive culture. So this is my last slide. So in this journey of leadership, there are many times when one confronts a whole suite of realities, but usually it's looking backwards. Looking backwards, you can see the gendered nature of leadership can impede your confidence. Looking forward, you can see that what needs to be done may have to be something different than what has been done before. And it is particularly important if we are to grapple with the changing economic circumstances of the whole world, and including our own country, if we're to include those qualified women who are passionate about their science, as I have been passionate through my career, into supporting and working towards that next innovation future. I just thought I'd finish off. This was Mary Lou Pardue again, and we read her first quote, and then as she moves through, and this is the confidence that we start out with, that we have to have. And she says, gradually, however, their eyes were opened to the realization that the playing field is not level after all, and that they, meaning senior women professors in science at MIT at that time, that they had paid a high price, both personally and professionally, as a result. Now, I don't know about you as leaders and staff in the institution, or as parents with daughters. This is my research teams at different points. They all get younger, I get older, at different points. And I think to lose that remarkable talented women out of the career pipeline too soon would just be a remarkable loss of some of the most impressive talent that I've come across. And I don't think that we should be hesitant to experiment, to pilot, to work to address something which has so far proved intractable, but I think with a bit of momentum behind it, good leaders such as the SAGE initiative, good cross-cultural engagement so we understand different cultural contexts, and great coalitions of the willing, then I think there is a fighting chance that that quote from Mary Lou Pardue will not apply to this next generation of great STEM women. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your participation today, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Have a wonderful evening. If you have any questions to address to Professor McMillen.
So Professor McMillen, do you think the intervention you're talking about, do you think the right time is when they start their career, or do you think it should come in a much earlier stage, like in the university level? Because some of my friends who are thinking about this have already decided, say, I'm going to be doing this, and sometimes they are much more focused because they know there's going to be a problem. And probably we need to intervene much earlier, like in the university.
Yes,
yeah.
I think I've listened to what I found really helpful is when people who are going through university and just like begin, their reality is the reality, not my reality, and beginning to say, does it matter? How could we shape our future? What would the future look like for us that we would make our mind up, not just to get a great degree in science so we can, enjoy the dinner table conversation about it, but actually that would hold us, would meet our needs. And everyone is different, so everyone will be using that for different purposes. But I think it's worth, we brought in the SAGE initiative early, mid, senior career researchers together in very large workshops to really distill down what were the major issues. And I would agree with you. I think starting, it looks like there's no problem there, but your point is it's building. Expectations, the voices in head of parents, of your own voice, of your own confidence. If you've never seen a female professor lecturing you, it doesn't occur to you that you might actually be one. And I think we know this as we've gone through, and we underestimate its impact. So I would say bringing students of science together to just chart what would be good at that point before we then move into the more professional career point is certainly important.
I think my question was pretty much related to that, but the point you brought up at the beginning about not wanting to put people off too early as well.
Yes.
So I've mentioned it to a few undergrads we have here that are going abroad, and I hesitate whether I want to talk to them about women in science issues, because, and when I do, they look at me like, really? And I thought, oh, if I don't want to discourage them, have I made them worry for nothing? So maybe it's something about how you approach it that puts a positive spin on it somehow. I don't know how you do that.
I think if you approach anything as a problem, it certainly creates one where there might not have been one before. I was berated by one of my good colleagues when I gave a talk into some good people. Said, well, I tell people exactly how awful it is. Oh no, because it may not be awful, and it isn't quite awful. It's something that you become particularly aware of, as we talked about through the career. I think if people come together and young undergraduates, we're not talking about a problem, we're talking about expectations of career and life. What are our expectations of career and life? It's perfectly possible they're different for men and women, that's fine. But how do we then accommodate those differences in a career structure? And I think that's the important piece, because at the moment the differences in expectations for men and women can result in a career structure that only matches one set of expectations. So I think bringing people together to say your expectations, what are you hoping the future holds? Where do you see your ability to degree, and how do you want, you'll get a diversity of immense proportions within men and within women. I don't think it splits along lines, it splits along cohorts of aspiration. There'll be people who want to be leaders, there'll be people who want a decent salary but want to come home at night and not have to bring stuff home. There'll be people who want to travel with their science. There'll be people who want to work in NGOs with their science. There'll be people who want to be entrepreneurs. I think these are different futures, and creating career paths and understanding expectations is perhaps and saying this is because we want to make career paths that can at least have some possibility of delivering, because the gap, the dropout across not only academia but outside academia is extremely worrying too. So I agree with you. I tussle with it, yes. Tussle with it.
Thank you so much. I thought that was really, really fabulous. And although it's about science, there's so many parallels I can draw with what we see happening in faculties of law around the world, and particularly in Hong Kong and Hong Kong's institutions. I was struck by what you've just said about, you go into a classroom and if you don't see female academics, then you don't imagine that you might be one. And for me, the first day that I started teaching at Hong Kong U in the law faculty, in fact, students were looking around for the professor, wondering, well, where is she? I don't really see anybody, or where is he? And at the end of my first lecture, students came up to me and said, well, so you must be an expatriate who's been flown into Hong Kong on a package to do law here. And I was telling them I'm a Hong Kong person, I've grown up here, Hong Kong U is my alma mater. My question is, a lot of what you've said, particularly the point about diversity and its capacity to enhance decision making and the quality of our output, are we at a point where really we should be taking the conversation to equity in terms of diversity, including
Yes.
race and other variables, rather than stopping at gender? Or does one need to do gender right first before you get to the diversity piece?
Yeah, I think that depends on where you carry out your business, in a sense. For me, in Australia, we have gender is a 50% issue, and also we have our Indigenous leaders. And at our university table, we have in Australia the greatest number of Indigenous students of any Australian university, and they are the utterly emerging professional leaders. So 3% would be right, because that's population parity. So in Australia, I think in different countries there are different, in a sense, there's clarity around what's an important piece in that diversity mix. For us, not to have Indigenous and non-Indigenous leadership walking side by side would be a significant loss in Australia. So for me, I think every culture comes at that question a bit differently. I kind of get, I was talking to your president and saying that I like the Warren Buffett quote. Warren Buffett, when asked, how he became so successful, said, well, I was only competing with half the population. And I think that says it all. It's half the population. So I think if we can get some of those interventions right for women, as you said, they won't necessarily apply, but we get confidence.
Thank you.
Can I pick up on the intervention piece? Because I was looking at your data, and we think about the leaky pipeline studies across sectors. STEM fields have a different set of issues and obstacles around this, and you didn't really talk about that. Can you say a little bit more?
I really, because it's my lived experience, and you feel more comfortable when you actually can remember the conversation that kind of struck you as being slightly unusual. I can recall telling my head of department when I was pregnant with my first baby, and he said, well, what are we going to do? And that sticks with you, I thought, well, I'll have the baby, and you'll be doing it. Work it out. Anyway, so you tend to, in a sense, get more confidence when the qualitative and the quantitative align. In terms of the broader-based workforce participation and leadership roles, I would be prepared to test the hypothesis, being a scientist, that the structural issues that are about achieving within a particular critical time window is a really strong limiter. Rather than saying, what is it that we think? I think in medicine there's a tendency to do this better, because you can define what a good surgeon is. Maybe I shouldn't pick surgery actually. I'll choose physician training. That you can tell what a good physician looks like. You know its skill set, in depth of knowledge, clinical skills, and the whole piece. So you can be prepared to take some time and to get the solo flying hours so that you're clearly experienced. And it does seem to me you can get to that point, and it might be 3 years later than somebody, or 5 years later than another. But does that matter? The issue is, how do you get the structure to be able to deliver that for the people who are competing for the training positions? That's a whole different question, and one I'm not qualified to answer. But I can see that you can, if you're thinking of law firms, an intensely different culture. But why concertina it to lose talent? That if that talent was in your firm would add value. There's a fabulous HBR, you remind me, there's a fabulous HBR article on financial analysts, women in senior positions who leave to go to other financial analyst firms, and men who leave. And women add value to the firm they go to, and men do not. And the reason they do this is because women have an external network of clients, and when they move, they bring that with them. Men, they did a great analysis. Men build a power structure within the organisation, which supports, their competitiveness. But when they move, they can't bring it with them. And it, sometimes it allows you to reflect. If you were looking at that data and you were running a firm, would you be thinking, do I mind it's going to take 3 more years? Is it so important in the half-life of my business? Some businesses are, some businesses aren't. So I think I can only reflect on your question.
Yeah, can I ask you, like you talked about babies, and you have 3 of them. Can I ask you, did you take any maternity leaves, and at that time, did you actually continue to do the research in the lab, and is there any moment for you to realize maybe you want to quit in your career?
Okay. So I'll answer that question in parts. It's a good question. I took, between the 3 of them, 5 weeks. 5 weeks. At the time, it was clear to me that that my career, which I had invested in would not proceed in the same way. That's not something I agree with. It is something that was the case. I was out one day learning some molecular biology down at a lab in the centre of Melbourne at the time, and a colleague came around to bring another visiting professor and said, "Oh, she's not here, she's at home with the babies." Now, you know, which colleague, the comment came back, now there's nothing wrong with being home with your babies, but as it so happened, there was at that time something which sets a different expectation of your career trajectory. I think it's just about what I perhaps could have done with is more sleep, but what I would say is the following. All families are different. And in my own family, my children think I have very few life skills. Because in terms of practical skills, I have very few practical skills. I'm really good in epigenetics. Round the dinner table, that doesn't take up much conversation. You know, they're not really that interested. So my children very much look at me as a slightly daffy mother, and always have, because they've never seen me as a particular president. Yes, I would say they think the opposite. And so in our family, the dynamic has worked. They are really well-adjusted adults, much more well-adjusted than I am. They, you know, understand the world in which I work, and it is at a time when I'm really enjoying that period now. And I don't think anything along the way would have changed them, because I think they were on their trajectory. My job was to make sure that, you know, that they understood that family was critical to me, and it could be critical to me even if I was on a plane. That was okay. That's a complex answer, and it's a complex answer, I think, in all families. And you know when in your family it's working, and you know in your family when it's not. And different people will make different decisions. I simply think not everyone should be compelled to make the same decision. Rather, they should be in a system that allows them the opportunity to make different decisions.